The glutes, also known as the butt muscles, have become one of the most popular muscle groups to train. This is for a lot of reasons, but most likely, 3 main reasons. The glutes obviously are a huge facet of someone's lower body physique, and a poppin' booty stands out really well. The glutes are incredibly important for sporting performance, helping generate a ton of force for moving us in different directions. And the glutes are often viewed as a critical muscle group to train for various aches and pains people may be experiencing. While many people spend time trying to train their glutes, they often fall short making a good change in their glutes due to poor exercise selection, poor exercise technique, and many other factors we're going to tackle today. In deciding the best exercises for the glutes, we need to understand their anatomy, both in general and regionally, their functions, their length-tension relationships, and how to practically challenge them. When we look at the anatomy of the glutes, we're actually looking at 3 muscles: the gluteus maximus, the gluteus medius, and the gluteus minimus. The gluteus maximus is the largest of the 3, making up about 75% of the volume of the booty, and is the largest muscle in the human body. It originates on the back side of the body, along the ilium and sacrum, and then runs downwards and laterally over to the gluteal tuberosity of the femur and IT band where it inserts. Due to these origins and insertions, we see that the glute max performs hip extension, hip abduction, and hip external rotation. When we look at the glute max closer, we can see that it actually has 2 primary subdivisions: the upper glute max and the lower glute max. The upper glute max contributes to all 3 motions, but primarily performs hip abduction and hip external rotation. In contrast, the lower glute max minimally assists with hip external rotation and hip abduction, but instead primarily performs hip extension. The glute medius is the second largest of the 3, contributing to about 18.5% of the volume on the backside. It originates up on the lateral side of the ilium and then runs in a fan-shaped direction downwards to the greater trochanter of the femur. Based on these attachments, the glute med primarily does hip abduction, with some contribution towards hip extension, hip external rotation, hip flexion, and hip internal rotation. If we look more closely at the glute med, we can see that there are 3 subdivisions: the anterior, the middle, and the posterior parts, helping to explain why it has so many various actions. All 3 of these parts assist in hip abduction, but the anterior part assists in hip flexion and internal rotation, and the posterior does hip extension and hip external rotation. Since the gluteus minimus only accounts for 5 to 8% of the volume, and it gets worked quite well doing hip abduction and training the other motions, we aren't going to be focusing on it today. Now, when it comes to deciding the best exercises for these muscles, it's not just about what actions they do. If that were the case, we could just do any hip extension, hip abduction, or hip external rotation movement and grow a huge booty. In reality though, that's where many people go wrong. Instead, we want to look at when these muscles work best and get worked more than other muscles that do these actions. When we look at the glute max's function more in depth, we can see that during hip extension, it has the best leverages over other hip extensors towards full hip extension. During hip external rotation, it appears that having more of a challenge towards the end range of motion is best for listing the most amount of challenge for the glute max. And for hip abduction, we see a similar trend where the glutes will be worked best towards the end of the range of motion, closer to the peak point of hip abduction, not more close to hip adduction. For the glute med, since it has some overlapping actions with the glute max, particularly the upper fibers of the glute max, it's often best to focus on the opposite actions. That's why the glute med is typically best trained in a hip extended position with the hip internally rotated, working on hip abduction motions. This helps to minimize working the other hip abductors like the TFL and focusing more on the glute med. When we consider these details, we can start to pick movements that match up best with this and select the best exercises. The first exercise that many people will tout as the king for glutes is the squat. The squat has become so popular for the glutes that it has a cult following known as squat for a butt. A study from Kubo et al. 2019 actually examined how squat training impacted muscle growth on different areas, and they saw that over 10 weeks the glute max was able to increase by 6.7%, which is quite substantial. In particular, they demonstrated that if you're going to squat for glute growth, you want to do deep squats, as full squats resulted in approximately 3 times as much muscle growth as half squats. With that said, one argument against the squat is that it is also a very effective quadriceps and adductor exercise. Typically, when people are looking for the best glute exercise, they're looking for an exercise that emphasizes the glutes over the legs. As well, since a lot of people are already squatting in their program and looking to add on glute exercises, I don't know if I would call the best exercise for the glutes the squat. That's where these other exercises come in. The first exercise is the hip thrust. The hip thrust has demonstrated the highest glute EMG readings for compound exercises and regularly shows best results for glute growth. With that said, we want to make sure we perform the exercise appropriately to get the most out of it. First thing is finding something to have your shoulders supported on that is going to be sturdy and not moving. Ideally, you get something that is right around the bottom of your kneecap for height. Generally, this is going to be around 14 to 16 inches for most people. This will put you in an ideal position to get the most out of your glutes during the movement. This can be an issue for a lot of people, so if you find that the height of the bench or box that you're going to use is too high, consider elevating your feet and your hips to let you get into a better position. When you do the movement, make sure to use a squat pad, an Eric's pad, or some sort of other thick material to stop the bar from digging into your hips and allow you to really push against it. From here, drive the hips up, think about doing a mini crunch and bringing your belt buckle to your chin. This will encourage you to get into full hip extension and get some posterior pelvic tilting for maximum glute engagement. Two more important details on this exercise are the knee angle and the foot position. When we get to the top of the hip thrust, we want about a vertical shin. A recent paper from Garcia et al. 2020 found when the feet were further out, the glute activity went down and the hamstring activity went up. With the feet further out, we have to resist the knees from extending, making the hamstrings work to flex the knee and extend the hip together. Garcia's study also found that by taking the feet slightly wider and having a bit of a toes turned out position, you're able to get more glute max and glute med engagement. This makes a lot of sense when we look at the fibers of the glute max again. Since they run downwards and on an angle out, having a wider stance should put them in a more optimal position for max engagement. Now, if you can't set up a hip thrust for whatever reason, you can do a standard glute bridge with a barbell on the ground as well. If you'd like us to do a dedicated video all about the hip thrust, its variations, and how to optimally set it up, let us know in the comments. Now, after the hip thrust and its variants, the next best glute exercise is the sumo deadlift. Deadlift variations in general use the glutes to a very high degree. The sumo deadlift in particular has a good potential to challenge the glutes because it takes the glutes to that greater degree of hip abduction and hip extension that we discussed earlier. When executing the sumo deadlift to maximize glute challenge, consider experimenting with a wider foot stance to get that end range abduction, and then play around with more of a toes out position to utilize a greater degree of range on external rotation. One last thing to think about experimenting with is going to a deeper range of motion, also known as a deficit. Since the glutes get stretched when the hip flexes, going into a deeper range may be beneficial. This can be done through standing on something or using smaller plates. Now, the squat, hip thrust, and sumo deadlifts are all bilateral exercises, meaning you do them with both legs. Bilateral exercises are great since they're stable and allow us to really use heavier loading. But when we consider the function of the glutes again, it's important that we start to consider unilateral exercises. A unilateral exercise is where we use one leg, like a single leg squat, single leg deadlift, or a single leg hip thrust. When we do these versions of movement, our glutes have to work really hard to maintain our pelvis position side to side and rotationally. Some unilateral exercises have shown very similar glute demands to their bilateral counterparts, so it's a set of movements that shouldn't be neglected. When it comes to picking the absolute best exercises, the single leg deadlift with a landmine attachment and a perpendicular loading is probably one of the best. With its challenge on resisting rotating as the bar comes across the body and maintaining the pelvis position, it's a great booty builder. The step up has also been shown to have a very high demand on the glutes, particularly when done at higher heights. You can see that when we drive up and our rear foot leaves the ground, our glutes have to work to not let our hip drop down. Generally, loading this up with a pair of dumbbells will be best. And then we'd be hard pressed to not include the single leg hip thrust. However, I will say that doing a deficit single leg hip thrust is a great one to particularly include because it takes advantage of that deep stretch and work through more range of motion. You can load it up with a dumbbell or a barbell across your lap. Now the movements that we've discussed are what should make up the bulk of glute focused training, since these compound movements challenge the glutes to the best degree overall. But these movements do emphasize hip extension more than hip abduction and hip external rotation. To really round out a comprehensive best glute exercise list, we need to include some exercises that cover these. When looking at hip abduction, there are two top exercises. Firstly, the popular sidestepping exercise. This can be a very effective exercise for working the glutes, particularly the glute med. If you want to get the most out of this exercise, it's important that we dial in a few technical factors. Keep the knees driving out. It's common people will let their knees come in while stepping to the side, but that reduces how much abduction we do and takes away from the glute med working hard. Make sure to keep your toes forward. This helps to emphasize the glute med over the TFL as we work on abducting. Try not to go up and down, but instead keep a level position going side to side. Bobbing up and down will start loading the thighs more and take away from the glutes working as hard as they could. People will commonly ask where the best spot to put the band is, and while the band position makes a bit of a difference, what matters more is the previous points. Start with your band at the knees, and if you need to increase the challenge, move it to your ankles. Then, if you need to increase the challenge further, move it to your toes. The second exercise for hip abduction is going to be the side-lying hip abduction. The last move is fantastic, but it technically isn't a pure hip abduction. That's where the side-lying hip abduction exercise really shines. In this exercise, we keep our knees straight while moving our leg, and if we keep our toes forward like the last exercise, it's a pure hip abduction exercise. While doing this exercise, along with keeping your toes forward, you also want to focus on moving at the hip and not just hiking your hip up and down, moving at the spine. Just like with the last exercise, starting with the band at the knees, then moving it down to the ankles, and then down to the toes as you increase your strength is best. Those two exercises are going to cover hip abduction really well. As we start to move towards hip external rotation, there are a few exercises which work really well to round out the list of the movements that we've looked at so far. The first exercise is the classic clamshell. This exercise works on pure hip external rotation. Traditionally, this movement's been done at around 45 degrees of hip flexion. However, as we've seen the glute fibers have various lines of pull, it can be beneficial to vary this angle and work on different fibers to different degrees. That's why I like the 3-position clamshell, where we go through a hip extended clamshell for a certain number of reps, then flex the hip to 45 degrees and do another set of those reps, and then bring the knees up further and flex the hip to around 90 degrees and do more reps. This can be a really challenging version and light up the whole glute, so use this as a burnout option. The second exercise that we can look at is the supine banded hip external rotation. With this, we're laying on our back and rotating out against the band. In this position, it's a bit of a hip external rotation and abduction combined, but that's going to happen with most of these movements. Now, something that can be really good about this movement in particular is that when we can do it, we can have our hips on the ground without any challenge towards hip extension. Or we can actually lift our hips up, maintaining that static hip extended position, challenging our glutes to be active there, and then working through hip external rotation. This exercise really emphasizes the more hip extended position, which will work the upper glute fibers to a really good degree. Generally, doing these kinds of exercises for max reps or a burnout is going to be best, since we're not able to load them up to a really high degree like hip thrusts or deadlifts. And with that, we've covered the best glute exercises. Again, we have those main compound movements, the hip thrust, the deadlift, the squat. Those are going to be some of the best options that we can utilize. Then incorporating those unilateral versions of those movements, looking at the single leg deadlift, the single leg squat or step up, and the single leg hip thrust. And then in addition, the other movements that looked at more hip abduction and hip external rotation. Now, it's fantastic to have this list, but a lot of people are going to be sitting here struggling. What do I do with it? How do I actually put it together? And that's where I want to call upon my friend, Bret Contreras, to explain his rule of thirds.
People would ask me, how many sets of this should I do? Well, a third should be horizontal, a third vertical, a third lateral. And then people would say, well, should I be taking every set to failure? And I'd be like, no. around a third, and this just it was coincident. I'd be like, maybe around a third of your sets should be to failure. A third, 1 to 2 reps shy of failure, and a third, like, especially with higher rep sets. I'm sure if someone had a gun to your head, you might be able to do like 5 more, but you don't go there. You just, it's nowhere close to failure. Not meaning you're just doing like wimpy weight for high reps, but yeah, you're not quite going to failure. And then finally with load, people would say, well, like, do you go heavy all the time? No. Around a third of my sets are heavy, a third moderate, a third light. Now there is a kind of an asterisk on this one, because let's say you hate heavy lifting, you don't have to go heavy. I always tell people, if you hate lifting heavy, you don't have to go heavy, but also it depends on the exercise. Like, don't just assume you hate going heavy. You might like heavy hip thrusts, you might like heavy leg press, you might hate heavy squats and deadlifts or something, and like some exercises don't feel that good, like lunges. You go too heavy on lunges, it becomes a ugly stability.
Yeah.
It just doesn't look good. Same with like cable pull throughs. You go too heavy, you're like leaning forward, and it's like you just, yeah. So some exercises lend themselves better to high reps and not, but the point is, and the research doesn't quite support this, but in theory, you could possibly further develop the type 2 fibers by going heavier, and then further develop the type 1 fibers by going lighter. But that's kind of, if that does make a difference, it's not highly substantial. It's just, one of those things where we geek out about it and it only matters the 1% or something, That's how it came to be. And then I started realizing I have 3 different things. I'm saying a third, a third, a third. So I just called it the rule of thirds with glute training. Could it apply to other muscles? Maybe delts, but
Yeah.
not every, like, you can't, probably not with like quad, like a hinge joint where the glutes can do a lot of things. They extend, they abduct, they externally rotate. So therefore you can have all those exercises. And then when you do the abduction exercises, when you do the horizontal exercise, the hip thrusts and stuff like that, they don't beat you up as much as vertical exercises do. If I just did deadlifts to failure and walking lunges to failure, I couldn't handle that much volume. I get beat up systemically from the deadlifts. And then lunges get me so sore. There's some people who I don't get sore from lunges. Lunges get me so sore that if I did 4 sets to failure, yeah, it's bad. Like, it takes me a week to recover. My adductors and my lower gluteus maximus get so sore. It's like, I feel like I'm going to tear something. So I don't go to failure on them, and I don't do as much volume. I might do 1 or 2 hard sets. Could I adapt to it and get to where I could do more volume all the time? Yes, I could. But I think this is how you see the best results, by doing the rule of third, keeping it in balance. Now, this doesn't mean you get totally anal retentive about it and you're like, no, I have to change. Like, it's just a goal to shoot for. But even in my own programming, I have months where we focus on the squat. That's going to be more vertical in nature, probably lower reps. Months where we focus on the hip thrust, month where we focus on, we change the focus. So it's not always going to be exactly in balance. It's just something to pay attention to make sure you are somewhat balanced in your training. And for this reason, I think by doing the rule of thirds, you can probably withstand a little more volume because you're spreading the stress, and you're going to develop all the different fibers of the glutes, all the different subdivisions in the gluteus maximus, medius, and minimus. And you'll also probably be more functional because you're training all the different joint actions. And, in sports, a lot of times you'll do all 3 joint actions at once. You swing a bat, you're doing hip extension, hip abduction, hip external rotation on that rear leg at the same time. So theoretically, it could help with function as well. Most people train for aesthetics, but the functional gains are well received. No one's ever like, darn it, I can now hit a home run. I didn't want to be able to hit a ball out of the park. So I think it's just a smart way to train, but don't become obsessive compulsive about it.
When you combine that information with the details we discussed earlier, you're set up for success to start crushing glute training and build an impressive set of glutes. Thanks for watching. If there are any other videos you want us to cover in the future, let us know in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next video.